Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 238 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. These days, most of us have a good working knowledge of what's going on inside our bodies. If you asked a random person on the street to draw a heart, or lungs, or a brain, the drawing might not be pretty, but it'd probably have some resemblance to what the actual organs look like. In the Middle Ages, most people, even doctors, never got to see much of the inside of a human body. After all, if you're seeing internal organs, it's pretty likely someone's having a very bad day. People definitely didn't get to see the inside of the body at work the way we can these days, thanks to technology like ultrasound and MRI. So how did people conceive of our internal world? How did they represent it in images? And how did they use these images to share their knowledge? This week, I spoke with Dr. Taylor McCall about medieval anatomical drawings. Taylor is an art historian whose impressive resume includes working at University College London, the British Library, and Christie's. She's written many articles for journals and for the public on medieval art and medicine, and she's currently the managing editor of Speculum, the Journal of Medieval Studies. Her new book is The Art of Anatomy in Medieval Europe. Our conversation on what medieval people knew about internal medicine, where they learned it, and how they illustrated it is coming up right after this. Well, thank you for joining me, Taylor, to talk about anatomical art. I'm really excited about this because I learned a lot reading your book, and I can't wait for people to learn more. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so you are picking out these anatomical drawings. Where are you getting them from?
Yeah. So the majority are in manuscripts, which are, of course, handwritten documents. The earliest images that we have are dated to the 1160s. They come out of a monastery in Bavaria. And there are lots of different kinds of manuscripts that I go into. A few of these are even in roll format, so like a scroll. And they're in libraries across Europe. Currently, they were originally in monasteries or in private collections. And then we get into paper books as the period gets towards 1500. So those are the main kind of different formats for the images that I'm looking at because, I focus on images that are associated with academic medicine. So of course, there are lots of other different types of bodies, interiors that you can find made across medieval Europe, but the book does focus on images that are made to go along with anatomical study. So they're mostly in books.
So the ones that you're mentioning start in the 12th century. Is that because other ones have disappeared or you think people didn't have much of an interest in it before this? Why are you starting to find them in the 12th century, do you think?
That's a great question. So there was most likely a tradition of anatomical imagery that does predate the 12th century. There are some Islamic diagrams that are of about the same period or a little bit earlier, and a lot of medical images. So first of all, there are not a lot of medical images just in general in the medieval period, but the majority of those that do start cropping up in the 12th century among the earliest are descended from antique or late antique predecessors. But in the case of anatomical images, we don't have anything that's that early. So for instance, the plant illustrations are probably the most well-known and the most well-documented. And we have papyruses of plant illustrations that are 2,000 years old. So it's likely that there was some kind of illustrative tradition associated with anatomy from an earlier period, but those are now lost. So it's always exciting to think about the possibility of someone making a big discovery like that and finding an older image. But for now, the earliest Western images that we have are from the 1160s.
Right. And you said that you're finding them mostly in monastic context. So is it monks that are drawing these, or you find it's people outside the monastery that are drawing them over time?
Yes. Initially, it's monks. They were the kind of keepers of knowledge in Western Europe. So basically, the way the study of anatomy and medicine in general went is started out the kind of base texts are Greek and Roman, and then those texts were transmitted through the Islamic empires of the Middle East in the early medieval period. They were translated into Arabic, they were augmented, added to by Arabic and Islamic physicians, and they kind of condensed these huge encyclopedias into more palatable, smaller compilations. And then as the Crusades start happening, the West and East begin to open up trade routes. These texts start to filter into Western Europe that way and were translated into Latin. And so monks were the original translators. They were the keepers of knowledge. They were also the earliest medical practitioners, as we might kind of define them. Of course, there was a tradition of medical practitioners who did not base any of their training on books. They weren't they weren't even literate. And it was more of a, a manual craft that was passed down from master to student, didn't require any kind of book learning. But the images that are associated with anatomy and anatomical learning all were transmitted through texts and the copying of texts. There's a chance that the earliest images, these ones I was talking about that pop up in Bavaria in the 1160s, were creations of the monks there. There's a possibility, we can't rule that out. But the style of the images indicates they were probably copied from an earlier, exemplar, again, that we don't have anymore. So that's the early medieval period. And then the book gets into, as the study of anatomy becomes more and more important, the different kinds of makers that are creating anatomical images that are moving away from this pattern of older images that are just being copied to creating their own images. And then the artists who become interested in the body for their own artistic purposes and creating, of course, their own new anatomical images. So that's the kind of sweep of the book, I guess.
Yeah. And what we're going to get into over the course of our chat today is why these might be changing over time. So let's start with the fact that I think when people think of anatomical images, they think it's always going to look the same, right? A heart is a heart is a heart. It's always going to look the same. But you found that they look very different. So tell us a little bit about why you might have images that look completely different when you're talking about anatomy.
Yes. Well, it starts out because the priorities of anatomy were to explain how all of the parts kind of fit together and how they can be understood in the broader scheme of the body as a microcosm, which is as a small reflection of the broader macrocosm, the universe, and how the functions of the body interact with the cosmos. And each body part was associated with a particular zodiac sign and a planet. And it was believed that all of these kind of external factors were determining the health of the interior of the body. So there was a big understanding or kind of push to understand the relationship between how the exterior forces affected the interior. The balance of the humors was another big part of medical practice early on. So there wasn't this desire to photographically reproduce the interior, which I think a lot of people, when they think about anatomical images today, they think about, oh, we need to know, when you open the body, you need to know where everything is and what it looks like so you can recognize it for medical practice. In this case, it was more theoretical. It was more based on the ideas of how everything interacted rather than their actual physical appearance. So initially, dissection was set up in medical practice as just an accompaniment to reading out these texts, which were written by or attributed to established authorities who explained how the interior functioned. And the opening of the body was really just to be like, oh yeah, here's the heart and here are the lungs. And it wasn't to study the body, the interior of the body in order to look at the body and kind of see what's in it. It was more to know approximately where things are, to back up what was being taught in the text. So the individual organ drawings, they all kind of can be understood as illustrating a particular idea rather than illustrating what the reality of that actual organ is in terms of its physical characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it goes back to Galen, especially, who is writing in Rome or the Roman Empire. He was in Rome for a while, but I don't want to trace his entire career. Yeah. But he's writing and saying, here's how the body works. So if Galen already tells you, you don't really need to see it for yourself. And sometimes this art, as you're saying, is to help people conceptualize it. So if you're like, okay, imagine the blood is flowing like this, you might draw it in a different way. So I think about when you're trying to explain something to a kid, you're drawing it in a
Yes,
certain way. It's not necessary to actually
exactly.
see it, right?
Exactly. And, we can see it even in what's considered to be some of the most realistic anatomical images, which are those done by Da Vinci, where he clearly was looking at a body, he was looking into the interior, but in his depictions of the uterus, for example, he doesn't draw everything because he wants to show his viewers what the inside of the uterus looks like. He doesn't draw the ribs in front of it, which would have obstructed the view. He omits a lot of things and presents a perfectly symmetrical, idealized view of the body part that he's trying to depict. So, everything in my book, all the images that I talk about, they are all being created to illustrate a particular point, and they're not meant to photographically reproduce the actual body part in question.
Well, let's stick with the uterus for a minute because that's one of the most interesting examples of organ drawing that you have, especially because there's a concept of how many bits it has in it.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
then even when people are seeing a uterus, they're still drawing it with the old ideas. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Yeah. So there was the quote unquote myth of the seven-celled uterus based on it was basically you could tell what kind of particular sex of a child would grow in, if it was the left side, it was a woman, right side, it was a man. There were three different compartments on each side, and then there was a central compartment for an intersex child. So it was obviously anatomically completely incorrect. And it was based more on these kinds of ideas about reproduction and generation, human generation, which has occupied philosophers and medical thinkers for centuries, millennia, understanding how the role of the male seed in reproduction versus the female was the female body just a receptacle, and everything came from the man, and how the mysteries of life and how it all occurred. These were hotly debated topics, and different philosophers took different stances. And so the images that we find are reflections of these popular ideas. So there's one image tradition where you do see depictions of the seven cells of the uterus, but then you see some other depictions that depict the Galenic thought, which was the bicornate uterus, which I think aligns a little bit more with our modern understanding of the uterus. And so it's very interesting to see which ideas are translated into these images and what they tell us about the circumstances in which they were created and the priorities of the people who made them.
Yeah, because I mean, there you are looking at a uterus and it doesn't have seven cells, but do you draw it with the seven cells anyway? And at least one of the artists in the book does.
Yes, it's not really until the later medieval period that we actually see a really intense pushback against the established authorities of medicine. Not really until they start doing human dissection are there some people saying, oh, actually, I have dissected a female body and there were not seven cells in the uterus. There was just one compartment. So it's interesting to see those ideas existing at the same time. And so there was obviously a kind of movement in some places where maybe they were doing dissection more frequently to say, oh, actually, this isn't really true, versus other places where dissection was maybe slower to take root in those particular institutions or universities. And they're still going with the seven-celled uterus. But again, these dissections were not meant to serve as places where artists could stand there and look and draw initially. They were really meant to reinforce what was being taught by the text anyway. So any dissections that happened were more dissections of the text rather than dissections of the emphasis on dissection of the body. So
Yeah, I do want to come back around to dissection in just a minute, but let's not leave the difference between drawing men and drawing women. Before we get to dissection, you notice a big difference in the way that people are drawing men and drawing women. Can you tell us what the difference was?
Yes, I think in the earliest tradition that we have of depictions of the female reproductive system versus the male reproductive system, the male reproductive system is very easy to recognize, and it's also a depiction of the external genitalia. The penis and the testicles are very obvious. They're drawn very clearly. You can see what everything is. There's no guessing. And the images of the female reproductive system are of the interior, of course, are of the womb. and they're very abstracted. It's very difficult to tell if you didn't have captions, and some of the images don't have captions. It would be almost impossible to figure out what you're looking at unless they very helpfully draw on a little fetus in there. It's very difficult to make sense of it. So yes, it's interesting, and also I think goes back to this idea that the womb was a secretive place that was difficult to understand versus the very masculine depiction and understanding of the male genitalia. Interesting. Yeah.
And I think you only found one image that really shows the woman with all her organs, right? An Islamic image, I think, where it's like, oh, she has veins. She doesn't just have reproductive organs.
Yeah. Most of the time, yes, the female body, it was rare to have a depiction of a female body, and it was really just to say, and here's the woman in her uterus. Yeah. So when they do draw the female body, it was either just of the uterus and everything else was omitted, or it was in some way tied to the uterus, how the uterus affects this organ or that organ or whatever. But towards the later Middle Ages, they do, which is when that Islamic image pops up, there are more efforts to depict the whole of the female body. But still, of course, the uterus is the big kind of marker. So
it is the main reason for being, right?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so you're saying that images are changing over time. And one of the things that you point out is because there is a rise in surgery as a distinct profession. So can you tell us about how surgery sort of distinguished itself? Because there was a real sort of push for this at the time, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So before approximately 1300, in the mid 13th century, there was an effort to establish surgery as a distinctive part of a university medical curriculum. And this happened mostly in Bologna. And there was a class of surgeon that kind of moved away from the traditional path of surgery, which was master to student. You didn't need to know any of these fancy obscure Aristotelian theories about the body. It was, this is how we bloodlet. This is how you cut into a vein. This is how you set a bone. There was a push by literate surgeons to have their discipline included in the universities. And they argued that actually we do need to know all of these complex theories, that we cannot adequately perform our duties if we're not also understanding the relationship between the brain and the heart, or the nervous system, or whatever it might be. So it was basically through their efforts and their compositions of their own surgical texts that really led to the establishment in Bologna of the earliest human dissections that were part of medical curricula. So that was around 1300, and Bologna was really the kind of seed of that movement. And it very slowly spread to the rest of the universities. It was more a Mediterranean area. It wasn't really established. Anatomy wasn't really concretely established in Northern Europe until much closer to the Renaissance. But it was very important, recognized as very important early on through the efforts of those surgeons in Bologna around 1300.
So let's just stick with this for a second, because I think people believe, and even I did for a while, that you couldn't dissect a human body at this time, not until what we're calling the Renaissance, because, the church was not into it. So how do they end up dissecting people, human beings, when there was kind of a pushback about this?
Yes. Well, there's a pretty famous papal bull that was issued around this time that was basically condemning the practice of cutting the body. But what they were really condemning was the practice of, while, on crusade, or mostly amongst the nobility, the practice of boiling bodies in order to transport bones back to Western Europe from the Holy Land, or maybe cutting out the heart and burying the heart in one place and burying the body in another place. That was something that the church wanted to put a stop to. But in terms of actual medical study, there was no direct kind of, the church never really interfered in that specifically, at least at that time. There was no need to issue any kind of bull or anything like that condemned the practice, because it wasn't happening that frequently. It was occasional. It wasn't even happening every year in Bologna for a while. it wasn't even written into the university statutes for a few decades after the practice was started. So, it was kind of flying under the radar of the church. It wasn't that big of a deal. Of course, there was something that people confuse it with is the church did forbid monks from shedding blood. And so monks who were medical practitioners studying medicine were technically forbidden from participating in dissections, but that didn't mean they couldn't witness them. So, monks as surgeons, that is, of course, a whole different thing. That really didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of actually cutting open the body, I wouldn't say it was seen as no big deal, but it wasn't something that the church actively forbade. And also the church did rely on autopsies from earlier, even before they started doing human dissection, to discover cases of poisoning or public health matters. So that was certainly something that was, I wouldn't say encouraged, but it was accepted.
Yeah, definitely doing autopsies for the longest time. And I think it made sense thinking about it for the church to not look into dissection too hard because they are the ones who are generating all the knowledge and disseminating all the knowledge. So, of course,
yes,
it's useful to them to have people have a good understanding of anatomy.
Yes. And also the bodies that were being used for these early dissections, it was a very specific kind of body that could be used. It had to be a foreigner, so someone not from Bologna who had committed some kind of heinous crime and then been executed. So they were kind of, the lowest of the low anyway. These bodies were not being claimed by loved ones for Christian burial. So that was certainly a part of it. And, it had to be certain circumstances. But it did become an issue later as the demand for dissection went up, especially going into the Renaissance and the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, especially. They did have to crack down on where people were getting bodies and how, because they were stealing bodies from graveyards. And so that, of course, was a real issue, but that was well past this period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good to point out. And it's not happening, as you say, every day. It's like maybe once a year you want to show up to the classroom on that day.
Yes.
And interestingly, you're starting to have a human dissection. But even then, this is really spurring an artistic tradition. And one of the things that comes up again and again in the books is like, we're drawing pictures because bodies really smell. You have to look at it so quickly and so closely that we'll just draw you a picture to save you the problems, right?
Yeah, that was definitely the defense of one doctor who also had his anatomical manual that he wrote. He had it illustrated, and he was saying, I'm doing you a favor by drawing these bodies exactly as they appear during dissection so that you don't have to do this, and I've done it for you. And you can trust me, like I'm doing, I'm showing you exactly the way things are. But of course, he wasn't. Their diagrams, as we talked about, they're expressing a particular argument that he was advancing in his book. So yeah, so it definitely evolved over the period. It's, one of the many reasons why I wanted to show such a range of images was to show how the establishment of dissection really affected the formation of these particular bodies. So that's a big thread throughout the book.
Yeah. Well, and then you have doctors that are working alongside artists, and you kind of show in the book how artists become even more interested in anatomy because they want to draw photorealistic or close to realistic images of people. So can you tell us about the artistic practice that grows up from looking at anatomy?
Yeah. So really the 15th century, especially like middle to end 15th century. So when the quote unquote Renaissance, the period it is defined in a lot of different ways. But in Italy anyway, it's certainly well underway in the 15th century. And a big part of that was the growing interest in understanding how the body fit together. So the artist started to say, okay, in order for me to be able to really affect my viewers by really gaining their sympathy for the suffering of the body of Christ or Christ on the cross, they need to believe that that's what they're seeing. And I need to know, as an artist, I need to know how the muscles layer on top of the bones in order to really express like the weightiness of Christ's sagging body on the cross. So we know that artists, I think most famously Da Vinci, but also, there's evidence that Raphael and Michelangelo also did attend dissections and were working with members of different universities in Italy to attend these dissections to really look into these bodies. So it became a real artistic priority. Notably, they were trying to depict perfected bodies. So they weren't trying to show you an everyday body initially, but it was a real shift in the understanding of the practice of anatomy, was the interest by artists and the elevation of anatomy as this central part of artistic creation, really also spurred on the elevation of anatomy within medical learning in general. And we start to see universities establish anatomy as a separate department from medicine, and chairs of anatomy became very well known. Andreas Vesalius was chair of anatomy, and his kind of work, which came in the middle of the 16th century, was this huge atlas of anatomy, anatomical images that he had drawn from, or he had worked with artists to draw from life. And that's really kind of seen as like the apex of Renaissance anatomy.
It's occurring to me as we're talking that a lot of the early medieval images are focused on organs and bones, but as the artistic practice really starts to heat up and starts to look more like an actual human figure, there's more of an emphasis on musculature. Do you see that happening sort of at the same time?
In the images, you mean?
Yeah.
I would say learned anatomy, medieval learned anatomy, there isn't that much of a shift to that because the images were still being compartmentalized. So the bones would be depicted in one image, then the nerves, then the arteries and the muscles. So I think it was more the function of these diagrams that were being drawn for medical students or practice was more to simplify as much as possible in order to communicate this specific information. So the layering of what we see happening in later artistic practice, that kind of emphasis on musculature, that sort of thing, we really don't see that reflected in these medieval anatomical drawings as much. So that is interesting, but it doesn't really translate over into the medieval medical part of it. So
Right, because the purpose is completely different.
yes, yeah.
Right. Right. So let's come back to those early medieval images because we haven't talked about Wound Man, and I think he's one of people's favorites.
Yes.
Tell us
yes.
about Wound Man.
Yeah, so Wound Man is an image of a man being bludgeoned and stabbed and hacked at by all of these disembodied weapons. He also has plague buboes on him, and he has evidence of all different kinds of traumas. And the Wound Man tradition, you can see there's like a dagger through his heart. So there is some anatomy drawn on, but it is mostly kind of like exterior traumas that can affect the body. And it's accompanied by a text that describes briefly all the things that can happen to a man and, kind of vaguely how to treat them. So it's part of this kind of series of full body figures that were used in medical practice and teaching and circulate alongside an image of the bloodletting points. So places on the body points where you should draw blood in order to help balance the humors. And a disease person, there's a disease woman and a disease man, which specifies the particular illnesses that could affect different people and kind of how to treat them as well. But it does stem out of the earlier medieval tradition of breaking down all these complex systems to be patterned as a single system onto the body and then reproduced kind of as like cutouts, basically, to really simplify the information and serve as like a quick guide for a practitioner to consult.
Do you find that these images tend to be in places where it would be something that you refer to sort of on the fly, or do you find them more in places where you would be studying it before you ever saw a patient?
What's cool about anatomical or medical images in general is that they can range from sketches where that the artist is not an artist by trade. It's probably a student who saw a particular image maybe displayed larger in a classroom and has just kind of scribbled some drawings into their notebook, essentially. A lot of these images were actually done by professional artists in order to act more as beautiful adornments to a specific expensive medical book or textbook commissioned by someone who might have been a medical practitioner, but also might not have, might have been a collector or a wealthy merchant who wanted to impress people who came over to his house to look at his collection of books. Because books were expensive and not many people had them, and illustrated books especially were very expensive depending on the level of decoration. So it's not really until I think, and even the earliest printed books, it was still very expensive to print and still expensive to buy books. So we think of those images that kind of made the jump from being hand drawn in manuscripts to being printed. We see that as kind of like, oh, the kind of mass market for medical images or books. It was still pretty limited up until middle of the 16th century, later 16th century. So I think the short answer that I have now droned on about to your question is that they were used for a lot of different purposes. I do think that it's reasonable to think that at least some of them were consulted by practicing physicians, but it also might be the case that, they were shut up in these beautiful books and left on the shelf. And what's nice about manuscripts is that we can usually tell how much a manuscript has been used. Marginal annotations by later users, or sometimes people cross out things and add notes. And of course, the actual page itself, it might be really darkened by oils from the skin if it's been consulted a lot, or faded or whatever. But a lot of these images that we're talking about in this book, especially the ones that are gilded and beautiful, were, I think, more for decoration than for consultation.
Yeah, I mean, the one I'm thinking about is that beautiful Zodiac man that is in
the Belzer.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's that expensive blue paint and that expensive gilding. But I mean, for something like that, you don't necessarily need the interior of the body to understand how the Zodiac affects it, right? I mean, people are still talking about the Zodiac, talk about how their sign affects them, right?
Yes. And I think people are surprised to learn that in medieval medical thought, there was no division between the Zodiac and Christianity. There was no, I think now we kind of see the Zodiac as being more of a pagan thing, and it doesn't have any relationship to Christianity. But in medical treatment in the Middle Ages, it was just another thing that you had to take into account when you were treating your patient. It was believed that, of course, God had created the entire cosmos and that everything happened for a reason and everything was interconnected. And so you had to know the Zodiac in order to be able to figure out which vein to let at which particular time, and the phases of the moon. And if you didn't make those calculations, it was believed that your patient could bleed out if you bled the wrong vein at the wrong time. Yeah, so it was all connected. And a lot of these images we see reproduced, like in the Belzer, that's a religious text. And so, you see medical images alongside spiritual images throughout the entire course of the Middle Ages. So there was no perception of any kind of conflict between medicine and science and religion, and everything was kind of worked together. So,
yeah, I love that. That's one of the great things about your book, is it's bringing together, showing how it's already been brought together by humans, medicine, science, and art together, and how they work together. So thank you so much for coming on and telling us all about anatomical art, because it is a fascinating book, taught me all sorts of things. And of course, it's beautifully illustrated with all of these strange and wonderful images.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to write, and I hope accessible to lots of different types of people who are interested. So I really appreciate you having me on and talking to me a little bit more about it.
To find out more about Taylor's work, you can check out her academia.edu page. Her new book is The Art of Anatomy in Medieval Europe. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, I have an article that just came out about the greatest practical joke of all time.
Wow, that's a big statement.
I christened it, but I think it works, right? So it's from a story called The Fat Woodworker. That was written in 15th century Florence. So it's set in the year 1409 and involves a woodworker named Manetto. And he doesn't go to a party with his friends, and his friends get mad at him for that, and they decide to put a practical joke on it. And the practical joke is led by none other but Filippo Brunelleschi, the Florentine architect. And they all decide that they're going to pretend that Manetto is actually someone named Matteo, a different guy altogether. So Manetto is going around and everyone's calling him Matteo, and he's starting to get confused. and they organize him to get arrested, and he's thrown into a debtor's jail, and no one knows who he is there. And then he's bailed out by Matteo's real two brothers. So it keeps going for a couple of days, right? And it is so funny.
Unless you're Manetto.
Yeah. Yeah, unless you're Manetto, he's going crazy. Like, who am I? The author kind of delves into his thoughts, right? So it's really well written. The interesting part is, although it sounds too crazy to be true, it could be true. Because there is a guy named Manetto that was a woodworker, and like the stories of his life kind of fall in line with what is happening in this story here. So I won't give away too much, but I think it's just the greatest practical joke. And I kind of think of like in the Middle Ages, your identity is based on, how others see you, right? Like you can't throw out a driver's license and, or stuff like that. Or here's my online presence. Like if everyone says you're Matteo, how are you going to change that? So it is a great story. So I wrote up a piece about that.
Nice. I think people are going to have to check that one out, because what would you do if someone all of a sudden started calling you by a different name? No fingerprints, no DNA, no dental records. You just got to try and show who you are. Yeah,
exactly. So we have that. Plus we have Life in a Medieval Town, which is excerpts from a 14th century German chronicler. And he kind of puts these little bits of information. He tells about a time when a con artist came into town pretending to be a bishop. He writes a song that men were singing about a nun. Not too flattering. And then like how 1384, there was a new hairstyle that was like all the fashion for men. So apparently you wore your hair short with crowns around the ears.
Wow.
I'm not sure exactly how that looked like, but if you were in 1384 and you wanted to look cool, that's what you did.
I mean, we should bring that back for sure. I bet it would be all the rage.
All the rage. By 1385, it may have been done with. So we have all that and more on Medievalists.net. Right now.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who supports my work and that of other indie historians through Medievalists.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of cool stuff like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of Medievalists.net and this podcast. To get in on all the action and support your favorite medievalists, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from anatomy to the academy, follow Medievalists.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.